The neighbours got their first real warning on the morning of January 9th, 1891. Not from the sky, not from a thermometer. From Nora Lind. She had knocked on 3 doors along the Dawson County road before 8 o'clock that morning, told each family the same thing, and been turned away at 2 of them. The third, old Werner Pfeiffer, who had come from Stuttgart in 1872 and still kept a German almanac nailed inside his barn door, stood on his porch and watched the tree line while she talked. He nodded once. Then he went inside and started moving his food stores. The other 2 families laughed. Not quietly either. Elsa Brandt actually called her husband to the door so he could hear it too. Both of them standing there in the cold, watching Nora walk back to her wagon, Elsa saying loud enough that it carried. That old woman and her feelings again. 3 days later, on the morning of January 12th, the thermometer outside the Brandt barn read -30, 1 degrees Fahrenheit. Windless, no snow, no storm at all, just the kind of cold that sits down on a place like a hand pressing flat. That's the black frost. No drama. No warning any modern weather service would have caught in time. Just the air going empty and cold and still, and the temperature dropping past the point where things die. By the end of that week, the Brandts had lost 14 hogs, 11 sheep, and their milk cow. Their water barrel cracked in 2. Their youngest daughter got frostbite on 3 fingers she would carry the mark of for the rest of her life. Inside Nora Lind's house, the little 2-room frame house the rest of Dawson County had been laughing at for the better part of 2 years, it was 61 degrees Fahrenheit. 1 fire, lit at 6 in the morning, not touched again until evening. That number matters. Hold on to it. There is something almost no one on the Nebraska plains in 1889 understood about heat, and it is this: where you put your fireplace is more important than how big your fire is. Nora Lind understood it. She had understood it since she was 11 years old, watching her father build a house in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. She had watched him refuse firmly in the face of considerable pressure from the men helping him, to put the chimney on the outside wall. She had watched him set the firebox square in the centre of the house, at the intersection of the 2 main rooms, so that every face of that masonry stack opened onto living space. She had watched him explain to the men why, and watched the men nod without quite following, and she had followed. She was 62 years old when she reached Dawson County. Her husband Gust had died of a stomach ailment in Missouri in the spring of 1888, 6 weeks before they were meant to finish the journey west. She sold the wagon team, took the cash, paid his burial, and had $41 left. She arrived in Lexington, Nebraska in July of 1888 on the Burlington Railroad with $41 and 3 trunks and the knowledge her father had given her 40 years before. The land she filed on was 160 acres of short grass upland, with a dry creek bed running through the east corner. The man at the claims office, a pale fellow named Coombs, who kept a toothpick behind one ear like a pencil, told her it was good land. He said this about every parcel he sold. She had a neighbour, Gunner Strand, who had already been on his quarter section for 2 years, and who came over to introduce himself the second week she was there. He looked at her acreage and said, without any meanness, but with real conviction, that the creek bed flooded in the spring, and the upland was thin soil. He was right about both. She spent the summer of 1888 living in the dugout that the previous claim holder had started and abandoned. She planted a kitchen garden. She drew water from the hand-dug well that was already on the property. She watched how the wind moved. In September she began building. The frame house she built was not large, 22 feet by 30 feet, 2 rooms side by side, a door on the south face. She had enough cash left, after the lumber and hardware, for exactly 4 windows, 2 on the south wall, 1 on the east, one on the west. The north wall was blank. She had thought about that carefully. What she was building toward, the thing she had been planning since Missouri, probably since before that, was the fireplace. Frame houses on the Nebraska plains in 1889 followed a pattern so standard it might as well have been printed in a catalogue. You built the frame. You put your stove, or your fireplace if you had the means, against an exterior wall. You ran the stovepipe or the flue up and out, through the roof or the gable. Done. Every house in Dawson County was built this way. Every house in half the county had a cast-iron parlour stove shoved against the north wall or the west wall. And every winter those stoves ran from before dawn to after dark and still left the far corners of the room at 40 degrees on a bad night. Nobody questioned this. It was simply how it was done. Nora Lind built her firebox in the dead centre of the wall between the two rooms. Not against an exterior wall, not in a corner. In the partition wall, the wall that separated the sleeping room from the kitchen, she built a masonry firebox that opened on both sides. One face into the kitchen, one face into the bedroom, a single chimney stack rising from the centre of the house straight up through the roof. The whole mass sitting on a stone footer she had dug down 4 feet below grade, below Nebraska's frost line, before she set the first brick. The lumber cost her $22. The brick, hauled from Lexington, cost her $9.40 for 1,100 brick. The lime mortar she mixed herself. The labour was entirely her own. Gunner Strand came to watch one Saturday afternoon in October. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at what she was building and said, with genuine puzzlement more than mockery, that he didn't understand the point of putting it in the middle. You couldn't get at one side or the other without going through a wall. She explained it to him. He listened. He said he'd think about it. He was the only one who said that. The men who gathered at Orville Denham's general store on the 3rd Saturday of October 1889 were not cruel people. They were practical people who had been farming the Nebraska plains long enough to believe they understood cold. And, when word got around that the Lind widow had finished building her house and that she'd put some kind of double fireplace in the centre wall, they came to see it. And then they stood on the road outside her house, and they laughed. Not quietly, the way people laugh when something confirms what they already suspected. Ed Brandt, Elsa's husband, a large fair-haired man who had farmed in Minnesota before Nebraska and considered himself experienced, said it plainest. He said she'd built herself a room divider that happened to burn wood, and that when January came she'd find out what the rest of them already knew, which was that a fire in the middle of a house just threw heat at the ceiling and left you cold at the floor. A man named Ott Schiller, who ran a small cattle operation 2 miles east, said the chimney would never draw right. He said centre chimneys needed to be massive. He'd seen them in Pennsylvania once, years ago, and that what she'd built wasn't massive enough, and that she'd smoke herself out inside a week. A third man, whose name nobody seemed to remember afterward, said she should have just bought a good cast-iron stove like everybody else, and been done with it. The laughter continued for some time. Ed Brandt gave her until February. He said this directly, standing at her fence, and he said it the way a man says something he has already calculated. His own house had 3 stoves. He burned between 9 and 11 cords of wood a winter. He had the wood. He was not worried. Nora watched them from her doorway. She did not argue. She went back inside. What those men didn't understand, what almost nobody on the plains understood, because almost nobody had seen it built correctly, was why the location of your fireplace determined the temperature of your house more than any other single factor. Think about where heat goes when a fire burns. A fire produces heat in 3 ways. Some of it is direct radiation, infrared energy, travelling in straight lines from the flame and the glowing coals outward in all directions, hitting whatever surface it reaches first, and warming that surface directly. Some of it is convection, heated air rising from the fire, circulating through the room. And some of it, a surprising amount of it, goes into the masonry itself, into the brick and mortar and stone of the firebox. That material soaks up heat the way a sponge soaks up water, slowly and completely, and it holds it. Here is what happens when your fireplace is on an exterior wall. The fire burns. The masonry absorbs heat. Then that heat travels outward through the brick, following the temperature difference, always moving from warm toward cold. And the coldest face of that exterior chimney is the one touching the outside air. On a January night in Nebraska, that outside face might be at -20 degrees. The masonry becomes a channel. It pulls heat from your fire and carries it straight out of your house, into the dark, where it warms nothing and no one. You are paying for that fuel, and a portion of everything you burn, in a bad winter, a significant portion, goes directly to the outside air. Now move that same firebox to the centre of the house. Every face of the masonry is now surrounded by interior air. There is no cold exterior surface pulling heat outward. The masonry still absorbs heat from the fire. That part is the same. But when it releases that heat back, slowly over hours, it releases it into the house, into both rooms, because both rooms share that central wall. The chimney stack rising through the centre of the house stays warm all winter, which means the flue draws cleanly from the first match. Cold flue backdraft, the problem that fills an exterior chimney house with smoke on a cold morning, that pours freezing air back down the stack when the fire is low, doesn't happen, because the flue never gets cold. This is not a theory. It is geometry. Where you put the mass determines where the heat ends up. Nora's father had understood this without knowing the word for it. The New England colonists who built salt box houses in Massachusetts and Connecticut in the 1600s understood it and built single massive central chimneys with 3 and 4 flues opening into surrounding rooms. Benjamin Franklin understood it well enough that when he designed his cast-iron Pennsylvania fireplace in 1742, he pulled the firebox forward of the chimney wall and into the room, explicitly to capture more radiant heat in the living space. He wrote about it plainly. The problem, he said, was that fireplaces against exterior walls sent half their warmth out of the house. Count Rumford, born Benjamin Thompson in Woburn, Massachusetts, 1753, understood it precisely enough to publish a formal engineering essay about it in London in 1796. He went further than placement. He redesigned the firebox itself, shallowed it to roughly 13 inches deep so the fire's radiation could escape into the room rather than bouncing back off a deep rear wall, splayed the side walls at a wide angle to act as reflectors, and narrowed the throat of the flue to a 4-inch opening that accelerated the exhaust gases upward, without dragging room air with them. He rebuilt 250 London fireplaces to his design within 2 months of publishing that essay. Thomas Jefferson put Rumford fireplaces at Monticello. Henry David Thoreau considered them an everyday modern convenience. The prairie settlers of Nebraska had skipped all of that. They had arrived on land with no stone for masonry and no trees for heavy timber, and built what they could build fast. And fast meant exterior wall stoves with sheet metal pipe, and they had burned enormous quantities of wood and coal and dried dung and corn cobs, trying to compensate for a design problem they didn't know they had. Nora Lind knew she had a different problem. She had $41 and 1 winter to get it right. She got it right. The actual construction of the fireplace took her 11 days. The footer came first. A trench dug 4 feet down, filled with fieldstone she had hauled from the dry creek bed, mortared in place. That foundation had to carry the weight of what was coming. A masonry stack she estimated at just over 2,000 pounds when finished. Frame houses on the prairie were not built to carry 2,000 pounds in their centres. She had doubled the floor joists before she raised any walls, and she had set the footer before the frame went up, so the load transferred cleanly to the ground. The firebox itself she built from the 1,100 brick, laying them in a double withe, 2 parallel layers of brick on each side of the firebox opening. She worked from both sides simultaneously, building up the firebox walls from both the kitchen and the bedroom at once, so the mortar cured at the same rate on both faces. The opening on the kitchen side was 32 inches wide and 28 inches tall. The opening on the bedroom side was slightly smaller, 24 inches wide, same height, because the bedroom needed less cooking access and more sustained radiant warmth. The fireback, the rear wall inside the firebox, she built with a slight outward slope, angling it towards the kitchen face. This was the Rumford principle she had absorbed from her father without knowing his name. A slanted fireback bounces heat forward into the room rather than letting it rise straight up the flue. She didn't use Rumford's dimensions precisely. She had never read his essay, but she had seen her father do this and she understood why. The throat of the flue she shaped with care. She had fired brick, and she used them here, forming a narrow constriction above the firebox opening, roughly 5 inches across, before the flue widened out into the chimney stack. This is the piece of a fireplace that most builders got wrong. Too wide a throat, and the flue draws weakly, smokes, chills the flue on exterior stacks. Too narrow and back pressure chokes the fire. She shaped hers by feel, and by the memory of watching her father hold a candle at different throat geometries, and watching where the flame bent. The chimney stack she built plumb and true, rising 14 feet from the firebox to the roofline, and another 3 feet above it. A centre-of-house chimney draws better in winter, specifically because the flue is surrounded by warm interior air all the way up. The temperature differential between the flue gases and the surrounding air is larger, which creates stronger draft. Every foot of that stack was inside the house's thermal envelope, inside the conditioned space, which meant it was radiating warmth into the house at every level, from floor to ceiling. Total brick in the finished stack, firebox and throat, 1,088. At roughly £9 per standard brick, the masonry mass she was working with was just under £9,800. That number also matters. Dense mass stores heat. A brick wall at 180 degrees Fahrenheit, hot from a fire you lit 4 hours ago, will still be radiating warmth 12 hours after that fire went out. This is what the physics term thermal mass actually means in practice. It is stored heat, waiting to come out. The more mass you have around a fire, the more heat it absorbs during burning, and the longer it keeps releasing that heat after the fire dies. A cast-iron parlour stove has maybe 150 pounds of mass. It heats fast, cools fast. When the fire goes out in a parlour stove, the room starts cooling within the hour. A masonry stack of nearly 5 tons holds enough heat to warm 2 rooms through an 8-hour night on one loading of firewood, and Nora Lind's stack was in the centre of the house. So every BTU it stored came back to her. The heat that a well-laid morning fire poured into 9,800 pounds of brick, call it 80,000 to 90,000 BTU, absorbed during a 3-hour burn, didn't go to the outside. It went into the house, all day, slowly, both rooms receiving it through 2 faces of the same wall. She burned 4 cords of wood that first winter. Her neighbours, with their exterior stoves and cast-iron parlour heaters, burned 8 to 11 cords each. There is another piece of what she built that the laughing men did not notice, and it is the one that made the difference on the worst nights. She eliminated the thermal bridges. A thermal bridge is a path through a wall where heat escapes faster than through the surrounding material. In a standard frame house of 1889, thermal bridges were everywhere. Every wooden stud that ran from the interior sheathing to the exterior siding was a thermal bridge. Wood conducts heat roughly 30 times better than dead air does, so heat poured through those studs night and day. Every nail, every gap in the chinking, every place where the builder had let the framing touch both the inside and outside surfaces simultaneously. Nora had spent 2 weeks before the first frost filling every gap she could find with what she had available. A combination of lime mortar on the exterior joints, and between the studs, tightly packed dried grass. Not loose grass, grass she had cut in September, and let dry, and then twisted into bundles, and packed so densely between the framing members that it compressed under pressure. Dense packed grass has a thermal resistance, what modern builders would call an R value, of roughly R2 to R3 per inch of thickness. Her stud cavities were 4 inches deep. She got R8 to R12 out of material she had cut herself. More important than the grass was what she did to the exterior wall surface. She had $2 worth of lime left from the mortar work. She mixed it thin and whitewashed the entire north and west exterior walls, the faces that caught the worst winter wind. Lime whitewash seals the microscopic gaps in wood siding that are invisible to the eye, but large enough for cold air infiltration. The air sealing alone cuts the effective heat loss through a wall by a third on a windy day. The neighbours hadn't done any of this. It wouldn't have occurred to most of them. You built your walls. You chinked the obvious gaps. You relied on your stove to compensate for whatever slipped through. Nora relied on her walls to let the stove rest. By the time she lit the first real fire of October 1889, her house was as tight as a house of that era, and those materials could be made. The masonry stack in the centre was cured and dry. The floor was laid with a double layer of boards, the lower layer running east-west, the upper layer north-south, with a half-inch of compressed sawdust she had hauled from the Lexington mill between them. Another dead air layer, right at floor level where cold most people didn't think to insulate for. She was ready for winter. The neighbours were still laughing. The black frost of January 1891 did not announce itself. That is the one thing people who have only lived in the era of weather forecasting find hardest to understand about this particular kind of cold. A blizzard announces itself. You see the clouds building. You smell the change in the air. The animals get restless and press towards shelter. A wet snow announces itself with the particular heaviness that comes into the sky before a heavy storm. Even the hard-driving cold snaps of January often come in behind a front you can see moving across the sky. The black frost comes when the sky clears. After 3 days of ordinary January overcast, temperatures around 0, a little wind, nothing unusual, the clouds broke on the evening of January 8th, and the wind died to nothing. That clearing is the signal, if you know to read it. When you lose the cloud cover on a clear sky January night, and the wind drops, the heat the earth has been holding radiates straight up into the atmosphere with nothing to stop it. The temperature does not drop gradually. It falls off a cliff. By midnight on January 8th, it was -18. By 4 in the morning, it was -27. By the morning of January 9th, the morning Nora Lind went knocking on doors, it had settled at -31 and the air was perfectly, completely still. She had known this was coming because she had watched the behaviour of her 3 horses for 2 days. Horses in the hours before an extreme cold event do specific things. They eat more aggressively. They press against the south wall of the barn. They stop moving around the way they normally do in the afternoon, and stand grouped together with their heads lowered. She had seen this twice before in her life, once in Pennsylvania in the winter of 1856, once in Missouri in February of 1884. Both times what followed was the same kind of soundless, windless, absolute cold. She went to her neighbours. 2 of them laughed. She came home and checked her firebox. The kitchen face was radiating at about 90 degrees Fahrenheit on the brick surface. She had run a moderate fire the previous evening, and the mass was still giving back heat. 18 hours later. She added 6 split pieces of dry cottonwood, adjusted the damper, and went to bed. The cold held for 6 days. On the 2nd day, Gunnar Strand, who had listened to her in October and had responded by thinking about it, came to her door. He was managing. He had cut extra wood in November. He had 3 good stoves. He lost 2 chickens and 1 hog, but nothing worse. He came, he said, to see how she was doing. He stood inside her kitchen for a long moment before he said anything. The temperature in the kitchen was 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, that morning, it was -29. The kitchen fire had been lit at 6, burned moderately for 3 hours, and been left since. It was now past 11. The two faces of the central stack were warm to the touch, not burning hot, but a steady deep warmth that went into your palm when you pressed it against the brick. The bedroom, which had its face of the firebox unlit, was 54 degrees, warmer than the kitchen because the heat from the kitchen-side fire conducted through the masonry and came out through the bedroom face. Strand held his hand against the bedroom brick for a moment. He looked at Nora. She said, "It works the same way as stone floor works in summer. The mass holds the temperature and gives it back slowly. You just have to give it somewhere to give it back to." He nodded slowly. He said he thought he understood it now. He was about to say something else when there was a knock at the door. It was Elsa Brandt. She came in without being asked to. Her hands were wrapped in a flour sack. Her face had the particular closed-down expression that comes on a proud person who is asking for something they do not want to ask for. She said her husband had gone to Lexington the day before the cold hit and had not come back, and her woodpile was down to 3/4 of a cord, and she was not sure it would last, and she wanted to know if she could bring her children to sit here for part of the day. Nora said yes. She said it before Elsa finished asking. No condition attached to it. No acknowledgement of what had been said on the road in October. She just said yes, and went and put the kettle on. The Brandt children, 5 of them, ages 4 through 14, came that afternoon and sat around the kitchen fire for the better part of 3 days. On the 3rd day, Ed Brandt came back from Lexington, and when he came to collect his family and stood in Nora's kitchen for the first time, he stood for a while with his hat in his hand. He asked her how she'd kept it so warm. She showed him. She walked him to the bedroom, where the fire face was dark and cold, and she put his hand on the brick. Still warm, she said. The kitchen fire had been going since morning. The bedroom fire hadn't been lit in 4 days. He was feeling the heat from the kitchen fire, conducted through the masonry, coming out the other side. He looked at the chimney stack, going up through the ceiling, through the centre of the house. He looked at where the firebox sat in the wall. He was quiet for a while. She explained the rest, the stud cavity packing, the lime wash on the north and west walls, the doubled floorboards with the sawdust layer between. She explained why a central chimney draws better in winter, why it doesn't backsmoke the way an exterior flue does when the fire is low. She explained what a thermal bridge is, what it does, why eliminating as many of them as possible mattered, more on the coldest nights than having a bigger fire. Brandt listened to all of it. He asked 2 questions, both practical, both good ones. When she answered the second one, he nodded once, the same way old Werner Pfeiffer had nodded on the porch before the cold hit, like a man who was adjusting a picture in his head. He said he thought he had been building houses wrong. She said she thought most people on the plains had been. The 6 days of the black frost of January 1891 killed livestock across a significant stretch of south-central Nebraska. The Dawson County Ledger, which Nora had delivered by mail, ran 3 columns on the losses in the issue of January 21st. Hogs and cattle primarily, some horses, poultry by the thousands. Families who had been running parlour stoves on the north and west walls found that the temperature in the far corners of their rooms dropped into the 20s, on the worst nights, even with the stove running hard. Water barrels froze. A water barrel in a frame house with a well-functioning central masonry stack does not freeze because the stack is radiating warmth at floor level as well as ceiling level, maintaining a more even distribution of heat through the room. Ott Schiller, the man who had said the chimney would never draw right, lost his milk cow and 2 calves. He came to Nora in February, not for warmth this time, but with a question. He wanted to understand the throat construction. He was planning to rebuild his own fireplace, before the following winter. She drew him a diagram on the back of a flour sack. She described the throat dimensions, the angle of the fireback, the placement of the damper. She told him about the doubled floor and the grass-packed walls. He took the flour sack home. The following October, Schiller's rebuilt chimney was running. He built it on an exterior wall. He didn't have the luxury of rebuilding the whole house, but he used the Rumford firebox geometry Nora had described, and the throat construction, and the result was a fireplace that drew clean from the first match and radiated noticeably more heat per cord of wood than what he'd had before. He told Ed Brandt about it. Brandt told 2 other men. By the winter of 1892, 4 houses on the Dawson County roads had been rebuilt to incorporate some version of what Nora had done. If not a full centre wall placement, then at minimum a Rumford firebox geometry, a sealed throat, and packed stud cavities on the north and west walls. None of them ever had a winter as bad again. What Nora Lind built in 1889 had a name in 1796, when Count Rumford published his essay in London. It had a name in colonial Massachusetts, where builders called it a central chimney house. It had a name in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where Nora's father had learned it from the generation before him. Pennsylvania Dutch builders, who had brought the knowledge of dense masonry heating from the Rhine Valley, where it had been standard practice since the 1400s. The name doesn't matter as much as the physics. The physics is this: masonry holds heat for the same reason stone holds coolness in summer. It has thermal mass, density and specific heat capacity that allow it to absorb large amounts of energy and release it slowly. A brick fireplace on an exterior wall has the same mass as a brick fireplace in a centre wall. The difference is entirely in which direction the heat flows when the mass releases it. Exterior placement means half or more of the thermal mass discharge goes to the cold outside. Central placement means all of it goes to the house. Combined with Rumford's firebox geometry, the shallow depth, the splayed sides, the narrow throat, the result is a heating system that delivers roughly 2 to 2.5 times more usable heat per cord of wood than a standard square deep firebox on an exterior wall. In a winter that cost a Dawson County farmer $35 to $55 in firewood, at the prices of 1889, that difference was $15 to $25 saved. On a farm that cleared maybe $90 in a good year, that is not a trivial number. Add the sealed stud cavities, the airtight lime-washed exterior surfaces, the insulated floor, the systematic elimination of thermal bridges throughout the building envelope, and you have something that genuinely changes what is survivable on a cold plain with a limited fuel supply. Nora Lind knew all of this. She had known it since she was 11 years old in Lancaster County, watching her father refuse to put the chimney on the outside wall. She carried it west inside her, the way people carry things that no catalogue and no claims office and no laughing crowd on a Saturday road can take from them. The neighbours who laughed called her house the widow's peculiar box. After January 1891, nobody called it that anymore. The central chimney house, the design that Nora built from memory in Dawson County, was not a peculiarity. It was the standard heating design of colonial New England for 150 years, before cast iron and cheap manufactured stoves made the central masonry stack seem like too much work. The salt box houses of Massachusetts and Connecticut, still standing today, were built on exactly this principle. One massive chimney in the centre of the floor plan, multiple flues opening into multiple rooms, the whole mass acting as a slow heat battery at the heart of the house. Rumford's 1796 essay formalized the geometry that made open fireplaces work. His shallow firebox, his angled sides, his narrow throat, are not ancient history. They are in use today. Builders and architects who specialize in high-efficiency masonry heating still design Rumford fireplaces to his original specifications. You can buy plans for them. They are measurably more efficient than the deep square firebox that became standard on the American frontier. delivering roughly 35 to 40% of the wood's energy as usable room heat versus 10 to 15% for the old square colonial firebox. The next step beyond the Rumford, the masonry heater, built on the same central placement and thermal mass principle but with a longer exhaust path and sealed combustion, reaches 75 to 90% efficiency. A masonry heater in a well-insulated house in Minnesota or Wisconsin today burns 1 or 2 fires a day, using a fraction of the wood a conventional heating system requires. The physics Nora's father taught her in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, sometime around 1840, is still physics. The temperature difference between a central chimney house and an exterior wall stove house on a night at -30 degrees has not changed. The rate at which heat flows through an exterior masonry face into cold air has not changed. The ability of 9,800 pounds of brick to store the output of a morning fire and release it through 2 room faces for 14 hours has not changed. The only thing that changed in Dawson County in the winter of 1892 was that 4 more families knew about it. Werner Pfeiffer had known it all along. He had kept it in his German almanac, the building notes his father had written in the margins. He had never found a way to build it properly on the claim. When the cold came in January 1891, and he made it through without losses, he came to Nora in February with his almanac and showed her what his father had written. The same principle, different language, same physics. She read it slowly, standing by the centre wall fireplace in her kitchen. She said she thought maybe some things people knew were older than anyone remembered. Pfeiffer said he thought so too. He was right.